The halftime show was awful.
What's going on? Why is this little black midget out here yelling and talking into a microphone? What's going on? The kids are I know what he's
It was a word that was being said.
It was hard to make Trump rally for the halftime show.
On February 9th of 2025, Kendrick Lamar was set to make history as he became the first ever rapper to headline the Super Bowl halftime show by himself. There were a lot of expectations as to what Kendrick Lamar would be doing at the Super Bowl halftime show, whether it would be a victory lap on Drake, maybe he'd announce the release of a new record, or maybe, just maybe, Kendrick Lamar was going to stand on the biggest stage of America and use his platform to make political commentary. And I think it's safe to say that we got a little bit of everything. We got the expansion of a new song, we got the Drake trolling, and we even got the political commentary. But as I looked at the Super Bowl performance and I looked at GNS to search for a deeper meaning, I realized that Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime performance was, in many ways, the reincarnation of hip-hop. And to understand why I'm saying that, perhaps we need to take a deeper dive into this line right here. On the surface level, you might theorize that the revolution is referring to Kendrick Lamar talking about an actual revolution being televised, perhaps in the next following years, or perhaps calling his halftime show performance a revolution in hip-hop, or whatever it may be, a revolution in and of itself. But I think that to truly understand what Kendrick Lamar meant by the revolution will be televised, we need to take a deeper dive into the history of what this phrase even means. Let me make it as clear as possible. Every rapper you've ever heard of, especially the ones that are politically driven, are in some way inspired by Gil Scott Heron, whether they believe it or not. I mean, there is a reason why Gil Scott Heron deserved to be called the godfather of rap. And to understand why he earned that nickname and how that connects to Kendrick Lamar and his Super Bowl performance, we need to take a deep dive into who Gil Scott Heron was. Born in Chicago on April 1st of 1949, Gil Scott Heron was the son of Bobby Scott, an opera singer, and Gil Heron, the first black footballer to play for Celtic FC. However, it was his mom's side of the family that Scott Heron was closest with, and proved to be the most influential in his life. In his early childhood, not only was he breaking color barriers, he was also introducing himself to different types of culture. Whether it be through being one of the first kids to integrate in his middle school, or listening to the sounds of a Puerto Rican neighborhood, Gil Scott Heron was gaining perspective to things that most of the country was blind to. And at the peak of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King making speeches and radicalizing the youth, Gil picked up an interest in writing. And it was his writing which would get the young writer a full-ride scholarship to attend high school at the Fieldston School, becoming one of 5 black students to attend the school. And after he was done with that, Scott Heron attended Lincoln University, where Gil Scott Heron would meet Brian Jackson and create the band Black and Blues. And to understand the impact of Gil Scott Heron and the Black and Blues, we have to understand the style of poetry that he had to understand how hip-hop became hip-hop. In the 1920s, spoken word poetry became popular. It was poetry that wasn't necessarily meant to be read on paper, but performed. In the most simplest way to say it, this is the most earliest version of what we know today as rap. However, what's most important about spoken word poetry is that it will influence this new type of poetry that we can call contemporary poetry or post-contemporary poetry, also known as new poetry. Because in the 1960s, the concept of poetry entered its postmodernism stage of life, where poets began using words that the audience could easily recognize to get the message through.
Looked at the poem said, "What now outside the wall I see, a shadow of an image me." I said, well, God damn, let me read this again. What now outside the walls? In the back of the room, somebody said, "Hey, this must be deep." This must be deep means that, like, I recognize all of these words individually, but damn if I can get anything out of the order in which they currently appear. This must be deep. So the idea became not only to use ideas that were familiar to people in the community, but to use the language that everybody could understand.
And to me, one of the leaders in popularizing this style of poetry is none other than Gil Scott Heron. But before we continue talking about Gil Scott Heron, make sure to hit the subscribe button. I would do a poem right now, but I don't really have a script for these parts. I just ask people nicely to subscribe, and if they subscribe, they subscribe, and if they don't, then they don't. But I really would appreciate it if you subscribe. Not begging you to, not even saying you have to, but you know, it's there. Anyways, he was also doing spoken word poetry with instrumentation behind them. And not only that, his spoken word poetry was politically driven. Or in other words, if you made a checklist of what made hip-hop, Gil Scott Heron would check every box. And even if you don't believe me and you don't know who Gil Scott Heron is, perhaps the poem that has gone on to define the career and legacy of Gil Scott Heron was that of "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." The title of the poem alone has gone on to outlive the life of Gil Scott Heron and take a life of his own. But what does it mean? What is the revolution in this context, and how does that relate to Kendrick Lamar? Well, let me explain. Or actually, don't let me explain it. Here's Gil Scott Heron explaining it.
So when we said the revolution would not be televised, we were saying that like that the thing is going to change. It's something that no one will ever be able to capture on film. It'll just be something that you see, and all of a sudden you realize I'm on the wrong page.
But I've compiled what few facts I could, I mean, such as they are, to see if we could find out a little bit of something. And this is what I got so far. First, white folks discovered Africa. They claimed it fair and square. Cecil Rhodes couldn't have been robbing nobody because, hell, there wasn't nobody there.
In many ways, I believe that the revolution that Gil Scott Heron was talking about was not just the radicalizing of young black folks, but it was the prophecy that was hip-hop. Hip-hop has been what has radicalized many of the youth into what they are today in terms of their politics and how they go about it. And more importantly, hip-hop just educates everybody, encouraging the youth to do their research on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and all these. Now, you might be asking, why does this all matter? Have I been duped into watching a Gil Scott Heron video? I'm here for Kendrick Lamar. Well, here's the thing. When I looked up Gil Scott Heron's style poetically, I found a lot of people saying that he was an aggressive, no-nonsense political mastermind. Someone who would educate the listener with a powerful message every time he went up on stage to recite a poem. And it almost reminded me of this aggressive rapper that has these political ideas and this message to him. And it made me realize that the reincarnation of Kendrick Lamar, poetically at the very least, is not most similar to Tupac or whoever it may be that you were trying to think of. It was always Gil Scott Heron. I mean, think about it. Arguably speaking, Kendrick Lamar's most impactful body of work was To Pimp a Butterfly, a album where he did a lot of poems over jazz beats, with one of the main theses of that album and that record being the political movement of America in that day and age. The career of Gil Scott Heron, on the other hand, is full of poetry over jazz instrumental or just instrumentation, with a heavy political lean that talked about the politics of that day and age. Furthermore, the more I looked into Gil Scott Heron's life and the career of Kendrick Lamar, the more spooked out I became. Because Gil Scott Heron died on May of 2011. Just 2 months later, Kendrick Lamar would release his debut record, Section 80. And as I thought about the connection between Kendrick Lamar and Gil Scott Heron, I realized that Kendrick Lamar ending off the set with Turn the TV Off was more than just his victory lap over Drake. It was him once again paying tribute to Gil Scott Heron and the revolution that won't be televised because Kendrick Lamar made sure to turn the TV off.
Turn this TV off, turn this.
Anyways, I know this took a while, but I really wanted to pay respect to Gil Scott Heron and the Super Bowl halftime show. I thought I brought a very different angle that people aren't really hitting on. And shout out to the Eagles, man. I fuck with Hotel California and whatnot. And shout out to them for winning the Super Bowl, man. I would have never thought a rock band could do that. With that being said, though, shout out to y'all. Shout out to me. Shout out to God, of course, always. Shout out to Jay Dilla. And yeah.